Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to all the attendees that I cannot see, and it's a pleasure to be with you this evening with James and to speak about a report that was prompted by the event in January of this year, but are far more far more important in its scope than the killing that led to its creation. The report is really focusing on what has been termed by other experts the so-called second drone age. It builds on the work and the findings of expert and indeed my predecessor in that mandate, Christoff Heyns in particular, who had already denounced the lack of regulation and the lack of legal framework regarding the development and use of drones. What prompted this report is the fact that we have entered a context where the multiplication and proliferation of the technology and of the drone themselves and ownership of drones are such that they have become, in my opinion and in the opinion of many others, a global security concern. So what are the characteristics of that second drone age? The first one is the multiplication of countries that have felt obliged to purchase or develop their own drone. At this point, it has been reported that at least 102 countries, including 35 that supposedly have now mastered the art of managing and creating the most deadliest, largest drones. That second drone age is also characterized by the democratization, quotation mark, of its ownership, with a large number of non-state actors, not only having drones, but putting them to very deadly use. And among other places, there were many drones being reported in Mosul, in Iraq, with and in Syria, with a very dramatic impact on the conduct of warfare. The second drone age is also characterized by the technological change of the drone. They are faster, they are smaller, they can be bigger, they are more lethal, they are operable at a longer distance. And while most military experts agree that drones cannot win war, they certainly can become an essential weapon in the conduct of warfare at the moment. And it may be, and we may be moving into a scenario where drones will actually be the entirety of a war. We've already seen some examples, and I'm sure James will talk about it, of drone warfare in Libya, drone warfare in the Caucasus, and in other regions of the war, and proxy warfare through drones. The second drone age is also characterized by the fact that warfare can be increasingly conducted very, very far away from the place where the target of the drone. What it means is that, and that's all, it was also already recognized 10, 15 years ago, but that characteristic has increased. The drones, as we know, are that the political and elected representative find in drones a way of conducting war at a very little political cost at home. It creates distance between the target and the soldiers, and at a more philosophical level, it is creating the myth of a clean war, and not only seeing the victims, but in many ways completely ignoring their existence through that form of warfare. Drones in that second drone age are part and parcel, if not center, of the new armament race. That is a characteristic of the restructuring of the international multilateral system. So the regime, the legal regime and the regulatory regime attached to drones, for all those reasons, is a particularly important, very topical question, if not a very spoke about issues. Before moving to more legal question, I want to insist on the fact that even though there are many myths associated to drones, I'm sure everyone will know that drones kill. Drone kills in many ways because they fail to hit the right target, because they are based on faulty intelligence, because they are indiscriminate in their targeting, because they target twice the same place, meaning that first responders will be caught and killed, because they create an incessant buzz and presence over people's head and over their daily life, which can have the most debilitating effect on communities. So for all those reasons, drones are lethal, drones are deadly, but most unfortunately, those are deaths and wounds and suffering that the countries that use drones are not likely to understand or to hear about. So that's some of the characteristics of the second drone age. The legal characteristics, in many ways, are not new at all. They were already there 10, 15 years ago, already denounced by lawyers and international experts. The use of drone, not always, but can very much be a violation of international humanitarian law, particularly when they are used in an indiscriminate fashion. The use of drones is often, in fact always, I will argue, a violation of human rights law. The use of drones raises a complex issue of determining what is a conflict and where is a conflict, through the multiplication of drone use alongside the focus and the international commitment to fight terrorism. We have entered an era where the distinction between peace and war, between conflict and non-conflict areas, at the heart of our international legal regime, those distinctions have very much faded away. This was already the case 10 years ago. It's even more the case nowadays because of the proliferation of drones, because so many more countries are using drones for the purpose of national security extraterritorially. I'm not talking so much in this presentation about the use of drones domestically, but that's a rising threat around the world that could also have policy implication. The use of drones has been accompanied by the weakening of the international legal framework that should protect the world against the use of force by state against other states or by states against non-state actors. And that process of weakening has taken a couple of distinctive markers. The first one is the fact that drones are being used to target actors that are accused of planning attacks, usually in the context of terrorism, but very rarely, if ever, are the governments using drones for that purpose, demonstrating that those non-state actors are actually constituting an imminent threat or are planning an imminent attack. And the notion of imminence was quite central to the construction of barriers and guarantees for the protection of peace and security. That barrier is more or less gone by now. The second is that the notion of sovereignty, which is a central notion in international law, that too has been seriously weakened, including through the use of drones. And we have seen that repeatedly over the last 10, 20 years when countries target non-state actors on the territory of a third country without seeking the consent of the third country, using various legal gymnastics, such as the fact that the country is unable or unwilling to respond to the threat that these non-state actors create. So those legal distortions and the weakening of the international legal regime has not just been characterized at the level of the drone and the use of drones. It is a bigger question, but drones have certainly been one of the key drivers of the weakening of those international, the international legal framework. The outcome is that we have a multiplication of so-called low-intensity conflict, which have very few geographical or temporal boundaries, and that again is raising the issue that is very much at the heart of the second drone age, which is the fact that there are no distinction anymore between war and non-war, between peace and conflict. What can we do about it? I mean, there are other issues that I can discuss later. What can we do about that situation? For a number of years now, the United Nations, civil society, my mandate, have repeatedly warned the world that the multiplication of the technology itself and the multiplication of the use of that technology is creating a peace and security challenge that needed to be put into the center of our discussion at the Security Council and at the UN more generally. The UN itself has called for a strong regulatory regime for the development and use of drones. I certainly have followed suit with my report. At the moment, there is very little interest seemingly within and among the states that own drones. There is little interest in moving into the direction of regulation. The US has withdrawn from the missile, the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, partly because it wanted to ensure that its largest drones could be free of the demands that the MTCR was putting on their export and development. But that is no response to the multiplication of drones and their proliferation. We have called for a drone technology control regime, and James can further explain some of the more technical dimension of it and technological dimension of it. In terms of process, unfortunately, at the moment, that regime will demand a multilateral engagement with it, which, based on my conversation in New York, does not seem to be very likely. So as a fallback position, I have suggested that a number of states, and there are states that are alarmed by the multiplication of drones or by the weakening of the international legal regime around peace and security and the UN Charter in particular. I have suggested that those countries could come together, establish a group of like-minded countries with the support of experts, and they could draw out what such a control regulatory regime could look like, with a view of bit by bit, step by step, bringing states into that new regime. They're going to be a multiplication of incidents. At this point, there has been a fairly, the Western public has been spared the impact of drones. I think it's only a question of time before they become the victim of it, either from non-state actors or because the absence of regulation creates such danger that we're not going to escape what drones can do. There will be more and more calls for a stronger regulation, particularly if drones become able to carry stronger loads and more lethal loads. So I think eventually we will move towards the establishment of a control of a better regime, but it may take many deaths, unfortunately, and it's going to take time. So in the meantime, we have made, in my report, I have made a couple of recommendations. They are not necessarily directed directly at the development of drones, but rather at how regional institution or multilateral institution could create some conditions around the development of the export of drones. And we could see already at the European level that there is some interest on the part of the European Parliament. Whether or not that's going to lead to something more concrete is open to question. I am an eternal optimist, otherwise I could not do this work. But when it comes to drones, I have to be very, I have to be pragmatic and realist. We are entering a new armament race, and we have demonstration of that on a monthly basis. We are also entering an age where multilateral institutions are being rethought. and challenged, and when a world where the international system altogether, the construction possibly of a bipolar system with many regional system, all of that are making the possibility of a regime very unlikely. But what it means is that as an international community, we need to put together some of the benchmarks, some of the steps that at some point we will be able to build upon for the construction of a control regime. And that involves what can be done by civil society, what can be done at the parliamentarian level, and we know in the UK there is a great an attempt to provide a stronger oversight over the British manufacturing and use and export of drones. So there are a multiplication of centers of actions, political and otherwise technical, that can be put to use while the big guys fight the peace of the world that they want to, and hopefully by the time they're done with it, we'll still be alive and able to move every effort and every steps that we would have taken to a greater maturity. So that's what I wanted to say for now, and I'm going to leave it to James to pick up on the many things I haven't touched. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Agnes. That was great. I'll just run a quick poll for those that joined us later, just to show you. We polled earlier on the delegates to find out how many were from a legal background or had a legal interest in this talk. And there's definitely a 2/3 majority that are interested in drone IT and technology. So James will have to deliver, but there's also something else I'd like to try right now, and that is ask you if there's a strong feeling about regulating drones or not. It is a large part of the UK military industry. So it would be nice, this is totally anonymous, if you could tell us whether or not proliferation of armed drones should be regulated. Please vote quickly. About half are voting. I will show the results. So you're allowed to be unsure. So please vote quickly. We have about 2/3 voting. Okay, thank you kindly. I'm about to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Vote now. Okay, let's see the results now. So a majority for yes. The majority for yes, but and a good third are not sure. This is interesting. We could try and run this later to see if the talk has changed perspectives. I would also like to try and attempt another poll as to how. Now, we may change our mind later on. We could try and run this again, but what do you believe should be the mechanism for regulating armed drones? Please vote quickly. And about half have voted, and about 2/3 have voted. Vote now. I'm closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Closing the poll. Let's see the results. Okay, an interesting spread. So there's definitely greater belief in international treaties rather than armed controls. Third, domestic law, very low faith in export control. That's very interesting. Yeah. I really hadn't expected that. Very interesting. Okay, thank you for that. Let's now go over to James. James, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much to BCS for inviting us to talk. I must state that I'm not an engineer in any way, shape or form. and my technical qualifications are non-existent. So don't start questioning me about the wires and the wattage. But I am a political scientist who has and an applied historian who's had the opportunity to learn about the history of offensive air power and see the emerging trend of hostile drone use as quite a concerning one, which has enabled me to be invited out by NATO and allied militaries to inspect hostile drone technologies and to examine their supply chains and what they are comprised of. So I can answer some aspects, but yes, I have that caveat. Because it's from the history of this that I first got interested. We started to see that from 1988, actually, there were warnings that the global proliferation of precision strike and drone technology was a real possibility. The US had started to really put forward its ability to deploy accurate, smart conventional weapons, inflict heavy losses on advancing forces by long-range precision and drone technologies, and to, well, as one report stated in 1988, to attack fixed targets anywhere in the world with an accuracy within 1 to 3 meters. But the report I'm talking about was actually a commission of integrated long-term strategy by the United States. And in that themselves, they state that high tech is not an American monopoly, and it will spread to a number of state actors and non-state actors who will use this technology in their own novel ways and perhaps in a very hostile manner. And they name China and some other larger economies at that point, like Egypt, as a possibility for this. And so it's here I can start to dovetail off Agnes's details she's provided, because we can start to touch on how China has really become a global driver of drone proliferation. One of the reasons why the US wants to make changes to the MTCR, so the Missile Technology Control Regime, is because it has been unable to sell drones to some of its closest allies because there are a control regime in place that stops the sale of technologies that are possible to deploy nuclear capabilities over distances of over 300 kilometers. And this has meant that China, with its ability to create quite high-tech systems relatively quickly and sell them cheaply, has been able to get in there with a number of what would traditionally be seen as US allies, such as Saudi Arabia or the UAE, and allow those countries to deploy those systems without any checks and balances and controls in place. And this is where Agnes touched upon the growing unease in the second Libyan civil war, what I call as the crucible of modern drone conflict, where you have a NATO member, Turkey, with its own indigenously produced drone technologies. Again, it had to do this because the US wasn't able to sell them to them, fighting a proxy war against the Emirati coalition, who have far more sophisticated armed Winglong 2 drones that have a 4,000 kilometer range, satellite connection, and the ability to send pinpoint precision missiles down onto Turkish and Turkish allied targets. And it's from this that you start to see like I say, a crucible, an experimental ground, a melting pot of future drone warfare, because the great powers are also involved in this. You have China, of course, on one side, supplying drones, largely for economic purposes, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia are Belt and Road Initiative members as well. But you also have the US, who is supplying counter-drone and counter-missile technologies in there, and Russia that are supplying its own missile system. So this is a test ground for great powers of how they will counter and deploy offensively and defensively drone and counter-drone systems. And the trouble with all of this is that these are conflicts which are not declared wars. They are largely unable to be controlled by the UN Security Council. We know that the Government of National Accord, the UN recognized government in Libya, supported by Turkey, is the one who's being attacked by General Haftar's forces, who are supported by the UAE, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. And this means that you've had a number of civilians, untold numbers of civilians, and it's already incredibly difficult to count those numbers, who have been caught in this crossfire. And this is where it really comes down to the heart of our report and how you seek to control nations so that they can ensure the protection of civilians as well in their deployment of force. This is just one part of it. As Agnes mentioned, you also have the Caucasus, where you've had a novel, although increasingly common form of warfare, where you've had Armenia and Azerbaijan deploying on both sides offensive drone technologies supplied by external actors or developed indigenously that have been able to allow them to deploy force against each other in what they would think is a relatively low-cost, remote way, but can end up triggering armed conflicts so that they can spiral out of control. Another driver of the global drone game is Iran, who has been supplying. I mean, Iran has had a offensive deterrence posture since the 1980s, and building off Chinese, North Korean, Russian technologies, they were able to create medium-range precision missiles, and their own drones, such as the UAV-X and the Kasefs as well, which have been supplied to non-state actors. And so you've got Houthi rebels in Yemen who have been able to be supplied with some of the most high-tech state systems and then use those against, again, countries that would traditionally be seen as US allies, like the UAE. So you remember the Aramco strikes from last year, taking 6% of the world's oil capacity offline. These were conducted by, we believe, Iranian-supplied drone and missile technologies that could be fired over 1,000-kilometer range to pinpoint strike out vital infrastructure. And when you think about how we can't control states using these, then how do we even begin to think about controlling non-state actors using these? And these are augmented with commercial technologies. So when the Houthis were unable to obtain Iranian technologies, they just simply used the designs, created fabricated fiberglass shells of the designs of the drones, and then bought in commercial drone elements such as transmitters that any of us could buy off Amazon or our local hobbyist drone store, motors, thermal imaging cameras, GoPro cameras, petrol motors as well from Ireland, from the Czech Republic. They're just ones that I've seen. And the boring things that make it fly, like the drogues on the wings and the wing flaps and the wires from China. So we really have an uncontrolled proliferation at the moment. And this is sadly the state of play.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was a very good overview of the sort of international state of armed conflict. And I think, you know, if we have to highlight the key factors here from an international law perspective, is that drones are being owned by non-state actors, which in practical terms mean organized armed groups, terrorists, anybody who can afford a drone can buy one. And that means that we are outside of the clear monopoly of the use of force by state in an armed conflict. And this is the point that Agnes was making. Essentially, you no longer know who you should attribute a strike to. I know that you haven't probably seen it, but we have produced a compendium of the report. We have circulated that to all our delegates. So I think we can dig a bit deeper on what drones actually mean for the laws of war and why they break down. Agnes, if you want to dig deep, I think now is the time. And particularly in the light of the fact that we were a little bit surprised by the poll results. I'll just share them again. Yeah. Let's remind ourselves. A lot of people believed in international treaties. 2/3 believed in international treaties, and less than 1/3 believe in multilateral arms control. Anybody who has the microphone open, please close it now. Okay, so Agnes.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and it may, you know, it may be because most of the audience is internationally minded and understand that one country regulating its own technological development and export will have very little impact, and that's true. So ultimately, the only way armament can be controlled is internationally. But we in my view, unfortunately, at the moment, we do not have the conditions for a successful process of development. It's not just the politics, although this is the main reason, but I also think the technology is not settled, if you see what I mean, and you know better than me. The audience probably know better than me. We are in an, we have just started in many ways a technological revolution. It is far from being even, it's moving. It's a moving process, almost on a monthly basis. You can almost see the technological development. Because it's not settled, I think the potential for legal and normative and regulatory development are more difficult, notwithstanding the fact that countries are not prepared to do that. At least the countries that are currently fighting each other over who is going to control the international system. So while I do agree that ultimately this a treaty will be the only way, and has been the only way historically for controlling weapons, we, in my view, need to to lay some of the grounds for a possible treaty in 15 years, maybe. Maybe I'm not being optimistic enough, but I think we need to work at maybe a more practical and manageable level, which is Parliament for oversight, because at the moment parliaments do not have oversight over drones regime for the most part, because drones escape the usual type of definition attached to the militaries or the counterterrorism and other reasons. So we need to strengthen parliamentarian commitment to understanding what countries are doing with drones, and we need to strengthen their ability to provide a meaningful oversight over that weapon. We need to look at regional instruments, and the European Union is one possibility. I've already mentioned the fact that while a treaty process is, in my view, not realistic, like-minded countries can initiate the development of a control regime with expert, with multi-stakeholder involvement for future, for a future rebirth as a treaty. I think I was very interested with the notion that the developers themselves, the technologies, the creators, the IT people who are behind the technology in many ways, who are behind the algorithm, what is their responsibility as a self-regulatory level? What is the responsibilities of those professional associations who are of which many technologists are members? Maybe more can be done there as well. We need more monitoring of the impact of those weapons, more voice from the ground, able to raise the alarm with the conscience of the world over the fact that these weapons are actually deadly, and that the long distance is a very dangerous, has extremely dangerous implication for warfare. And I think what James was talking about, that may lead to more localized peace making at some point, which would include the regulation of drones, or we need to include regulation of drones. Unfortunately, ultimately, I think we're going to see more and more accidents. Notwithstanding the development of drones for military purposes and offensive purposes, the fact that there is so little regulation at the moment, the fact that non-state actors have access to it, I fear that there will be, there are going to be accident, or there are going to be use of drones that would force particularly drone-producing countries to realize they've created a monster and need to do something about it.
Agnes, I think this is the right time to launch another poll, and this is specific to the UK. You've mentioned parliamentary oversight. So this is when we can actually vote and say, is Parliament the right place to investigate allegations of death by drones and then provide oversight? I know you mentioned judicial oversight in your report. Again, that raises the question, are the courts the right place for oversight of something that has to be speedy, agreed within a time frame? So this is an interesting, of course, I'm with you. We have to start somewhere, and domestic law and national legal systems should start moving. Your example of Germany in the report was illuminating. I had no idea, and that is phenomenal. So the poll is now open. Please vote quickly. Only 2/3 have voted. Kindly vote now. I shall close this in 3, 2, 1. Please vote now. Okay, let's see the result. Okay, the poll is closed, and this is the outcome. So again, a substantial not sure, less than a quarter no, and almost 2/3 yes. Okay, so more active involvement by Parliament. I think we have questions. Murtaza, have you seen any questions that you want to read out? Murtaza, I know that you're monitoring all the questions, and we have the options of giving the delegates the floor.
Yeah,
so
yes.
Raise your hand.
Yeah, thank you. I've tried to encourage questions, but none have been posted so far. So I would encourage the attendees, if they have any questions that they can't ask via audio, they should post them now. And while they do that, I had a few, but I'll ask one if that's possible to
Yes,
Agnes and to James. In thinking about what's the solution to this very difficult problem, one observation that came to light. Was that it's sort of a vicious cycle. The proliferation of drones by states will eventually lead to a demand for drones by non-state actors. So it seems to be a vicious cycle that you know, it's really a difficult question to answer, how to control this vicious cycle. And secondly, in terms of how to deal with this, I feel that regulation and laws are the way to go forward. However, when states themselves are making a lot of the drones for their own use, you know, if there is any limit to selling that technology, that still means those states can use them. So I wondered if it was a worthwhile direction to pursue to think about a code of conduct or effective guidelines on the specific application of international humanitarian law and international human rights law to this specific context of if drones are used, which they will be because you know, they're a military tool. You know, what are the guidelines and what are the principles that should be applied by states and non-state actors, because non-state actors are subject to international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Yes, well, I mean, obviously we'd hope that nation states do abide by international humanitarian law. But the great irony being, of course, is that when drones first, rose to being prominent weapons of American warfare from 2008 onwards, it was very much Obama's justification that they were part of a just war. They are weapons defined and designed as being proportionate and discriminate. They are pinpoint precise, as he would say. They save lives. They're off the back of Iraq and Afghanistan and costly wars that the US will be able to fight wars remotely now and never have to risk the lives of America's best, brightest and youngest. And that's the same for the UK as well. And here's where I echo Agnes's points, because it really is as a result of the fact that we can deploy force as a Western nation, as Great Britain, with our own Reaper force across the world without us really ever hearing about it. I mean, we don't know how many wars that we are involved in this particular way, and I definitely couldn't tell you the exact amount. But by doing that, we don't have that same accountability of the public. We haven't got the body bags coming home through Wootton Bassett, and so we don't have that public push to have the scrutiny by the parliamentarians of the way in which these are used. So I think parliamentary function is a way to ensure that these drones are used in line with international humanitarian law. In terms of, just to pick you up on a point about this vicious cycle, it's a little bit more disturbing than that, actually, because it isn't a matter of non-state actors, these falling into non-state actor hands or them demanding it. It's more of a situation where state actors will actively supply non-state actors with the same technology that they have, or very similar looking technology, to afford that state actor with a plausible deniability. That means that if they were to conduct an attack, it means that they can say, well, in that region, there are non-state actors that we do not control the way in which they use these weapons, but have them. And so this, of course, has its own legal aspects of being able to hold actors who may use drones for atrocities and abuses to account, and again, in line with international humanitarian law. So, yeah, just to make that point, it's actually far more difficult than we even first think, because this isn't an accidental move or a demand just by non-state actors. This is an active ploy by certain states.
And the only point I will add is that drones, countries, actors that use drones need to use them in accordance with the international legal regime that is applicable to the situation. So while I certainly welcome code of conduct and guidelines, these should be applied to aspects of the drones development that are not necessarily already structured by the international law. I know I've already said it has been very much weakened, but I will not want to contribute to weakening it further. So I think the point of departure must be that whatever the particularities of drones, it still needs to be used in accordance with the international legal regime, whether it is humanitarian law or human rights law. Second, we also need to insist on the fact that many use of drones at the moment are actually not done in a situation that is regarded as an armed conflict. And the implication is that drones should be seen as more like a policing intervention, and certainly should abide by human rights law. I know we may think, yeah, good luck arguing that. I agree that it may be wishful thinking, but it is absolutely essential that we insist on the fact that when a country uses drones outside a known conflict, then human rights law apply, period. So to me, that's the point of departure. And then the second is there are aspects of drones that are not handled by international law. how it's being developed, how it's being sold. The export control regime needs to have its own framework. It's not necessarily already covered by human rights law or humanitarian law, even though that can help. So I think for other aspects of that particular weapons, I agree that code of conduct and guidelines will be very helpful and could be part of what I have suggested, which is we need to start building the blocks. We need to start raising the understanding, the awareness, the knowledge, and wait for better conditions that will make possible our move to something like an international treaty.
Thank you, Agnes. I think while you were speaking, lots of questions. David?
Yeah, a quick question. Isn't this really a regulation for GPS? Because without GPS, you can't do the long range. And because drones are so cheap to make, you're never going to be able to regulate the manufacture of drones, but you could potentially regulate the use of GPS. You know, it's a GPS battle.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I mean, you know, I don't know, but I think this is exactly what we need to explore and what we need to, it may be just a small aspect of the drone, but it's an entry point and it could have huge implication. I am limited in my response to you by my lack of knowledge as to how much GPS count as compared to other aspects of the drones and other aspects of the algorithm and the long distance and so on. But I think it is exactly what we need to look at. We need to look at those components. We need to look at the people who create them, at the professional association, the individuals, and work in that way. So GPS, I had not thought about it, but great idea. Yeah. I don't know, James, what you think.
James, do you have a view on this?
Yes, it's something that we've discussed whilst we've been in talks with the US military, and I must emphasise, of course, that the British military and the US military also want to make sure they have the best practices here, and they have long traditions of ensuring that they try and abide by international law, at least traditionally anyway. But when it comes down to discussions of GPS, we have to remember that we've reached far past a point where GPS is really a controllable technology. It is everything. It is everything that we do in terms of our movements and our communication and our logistics and our transportation. And that comes to day-to-day life within cities, back in America and Europe, but also on the battlefield. So when you sit down with a force protection officer and you say, right, identify that enemy drone in the sky, they'll say, well, first of all, which one? And secondly, they'll say, I can't identify an enemy hostile drone from one of our drones, because actually the technologies are quite similar, including the commercial technologies, seeing as the US was using its DJI systems and testing them as well, alongside as ISIS was using systems that it was smuggling in from the UK and from Denmark. And so what I've been told is that, it's pretty much like lighting. You look at your screen as a force protection officer, and it's like a Christmas tree in the sky with dots everywhere, and you can't pinpoint, and you can't really take them down, and you shut GPS off, and then your military effectiveness goes out the window as well as your enemy's military effectiveness. So it's a difficult one. And when you try and put regulatory measures in place, such as counter-drone measures and jammings and geo-fencing and all of these buzzwords, you actually find, much like with the history of the improvised explosive device in Afghanistan and Iraq, terrorists are not stupid, and it is quite simple to get around our multi-million-pound measures. Some of the things that I've heard about the fight against ISIS is simply coating your transmission device with tinfoil, and you're able to get around quite some sophisticated counter-drone technologies. So GPS is a really, really difficult one because it is everything.
Thank you. Wow, that's
I think you're right. It still comes back to a technology control issue. I mean, in the 1990s, quite correctly, GPS was regulated by the US military, and the biggest hackers of GPS technology was the FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, because they used it in their planes. So it's always kind of been a battle, but I think we're kind of 30 years on from that, and there's probably some more options that no one's actually had the incentive to actually explore.
Fantastic.
I mean,
I think
when it comes down to some hard technologies to try and stop the use of GPS by non-state hostile actors, they actually have deployed these on the battlefield to try and stop their transmission capability. But they've actually found that they've started to interfere with commercial air traffic as well. And like you say, because they're integrated within that core part of civil aviation. So yeah, always open to discuss possibilities at regulation. But if it's hard enough to control the spread of the drone itself, I worry if it will be even harder to control GPS, especially at this stage.
Guys, we need to give the
agree.
floor to the audience. It can't be just a panel discussion. So we have Richard Berriard, who has raised his hand. He has not written a question. So Richard, if you can locate your microphone button, the way to do this is you unmute yourself and we'll unmute at our end. So there you go. The floor is yours. You're live, Richard. Off you go.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting talk. I'm wondering why the regulation would be specifically to do with drones. I think somebody said that by the time we have drones regulations, it'll be 15 years' time, and obviously, by then there will be an entirely new set of technologies that will be delivering death to people. So. Why would drones be a special case? Shouldn't we be looking at weapons generally and regulating weapons rather than trying to delineate a particular kind of delivery mechanism?
Mm-hmm. Agnes, if you want to answer one by one, just go ahead.
Well, I mean, I just very quickly, yes, no, you're right, and there is already an ongoing effort around the development of those new unmanned weapons and an attempt to already put a stop to weapons that could be operated without human judgment. Intervention. So there are efforts, and drones fit more or less, or in as part of those ongoing treaty discussions in Geneva. The point, I think, with regard to setting up a specific control for drones is that it is out of control. Unlike other arms, some of them don't supposedly yet exist, but there is an understanding that they could be developed on the basis of the technology, and therefore there is ongoing effort to stop them, the so-called robot killers robot syndrome. But the development of drone has been the object of specific fears on the part of the UN, including the Disarmament Agency, because it is so widespread, because it is so cheap to do, because it is so easy to recreate in an indigenous fashion, and because of those reasons, I think, and for the reasons I have articulated earlier, there are people and there are agencies that truly believe that we need to find a way of controlling and creating a regime for that particular weapon. But I agree in principle, and there is a process already that has been initiated a few years ago with regard to the development and use of so-called unmanned weapons. So, you know, the two goes together. You can have a bigger treaty with a larger focus, but you can also have specific control regime. The point I think you made is indeed correct, which is, as I have said, the technology is not settled. We don't know how far it's going to go at the moment, and that makes it difficult to move with certainly good treaty-based regulation.
Thank you, Agnes.
Yeah, I wanted to just pose some questions from the written questions, if that's possible.
Yes, far away.
Yeah, I'm just going to put three interesting ones together, and you can try to answer them together, hopefully. The first one is from Tara, and she asks, drones, you know, are shown as surgical mean of clean killing, but are they really that clean when they've been known to target hospitals and non-military targets, such as she gives the example of an MSF hospital in Yemen. That's the first question. The second question is from Timothy, very interesting. Any thoughts on the use of artificial intelligence with drones, legal and regulation of the artificial intelligence? I wonder if he's referring to the fact that, asking the question, are there any drones that are autonomous, or are all drones being controlled remotely by a human? And the last one was, what about the psychological impact and the implications of morality and emotions for the drone operators? If someone could discuss that. Thank you.
You know, yes, absolutely. Whoever is asking those questions is spot on. Drones can be used to commit war crimes because they are targeting civilian objects or civilian people, or because they are indiscriminate in their impact, or because they have targeted the wrong person. Drones are as precise as their intelligence is. Drones are often faulty because they rely on information gathering that is not predictable, that is very that depends on the range of sources, and the outcome is, you know, often, very often, civilians being killed. Not to mention the fact that some of the targets and the targeting is derived from some very weird notion that if you have a group of men together, so those metadata analysis, if you have a group of men together, then they are likely to be terrorists, particularly if they appear to be young. So there are, you know, and that's because metadata is suggesting some particular patterns that are then used for targeting purposes. I'm summarizing something far more complex. So for all those reasons, even though maybe the technology is more precise than other forms of technology, but the technology itself is nothing. The technology is based on intelligence. The technology is based on algorithms that may be faulty, such as those that are gender biased, or those that rely on notions of men being together being more likely to be terrorists than attending a wedding. So, you know, all of those reasons means that we really need to debunk the myth, and we need, for me, particularly given the work I do and my mandate, it is important to insist on the fact that drones have multiple victims. James, I don't know if you want to pick up the other questions.
Yeah, I can do, and I echo your comments in answer to Tara's question, and suggest reading the work of Derek Gregory, actually, especially about the targeting of hospitals. When it comes to AI and drones, Noel Sharkey has done a lot of work into this, and the campaign against killer robots, as Agnes mentioned. Here is where we're trying to look to a future where instead of drone operators, so currently, let's not think of drones as these autonomous systems that do killing by themselves. They are robotic and they are controlled from thousands of miles away, usually, especially in the US case. But there are usually around 7 people that are in the kill chain, in the loop of the drone's use. And in the loop is a way of discussing it, because it has to go through your pilot, your sensor operator, it has to go through a legal advocate, it has to go through the commander in the process. And so there is a chain that it has to go through. But what they're talking about in terms of next generation is moving to where the human is on the loop. So instead of 7 people being in charge of one drone, you'll have one person in charge of 7 drones, and the drones will go around and they will identify targets, and they will send that information back to the operator. And then the operator will choose whether or not, and perhaps it will go up the chain as well, whether or not that drone is then approved to take the target that it suggests. The more scarier option as well is the human outside of the loop. And this is where the 7 drones, maybe 100 drones, maybe 1,000 drones all around the world will be able to, due to the algorithms and the pre-programming, like Agnes has mentioned, be able to decide upon a target, take that strike upon its own decision-making process, and then send a receipt of that strike back to an operator who will then check that it was the right strike. So that's when we start to move through to autonomous systems that make the decisions themselves. There are drones that are automated at the moment. You know, when you had the strikes by Iran on Ain al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, where the US has its ground control stations there, drones are taken off and landed by human operators within the zone of conflict, and then handed over to a pilot thousands of miles away at Creech Air Force Base in America. But when the base was hit, the drones then couldn't be landed. So they go on a pre-programmed function, an automated function. They're not in human control, and they just hover around until the human's able to take back over and land. So we're at an automated level, but we're moving quickly towards an autonomous level. In terms of the final question about RPA operators, I've spoken to many RPA operators, and they prefer that term as well, remotely piloted aircraft, because it shows there is a pilot. But you can go between those who are very detached, most physically and mentally, and you have horror stories of a video game mentality and whack-a-mole and bug splat of the enemy. But, you know, I've also spoken to drone operators who are incredibly affected. The intensity of watching a target for weeks, if not months, watching them go about with their families, watching their day-to-day practices, gathering evidence on them, that persistent loitering creates a link, or so I've been told, between the pilot and those they kill. And there are cases of drone conscientious objectors. So, and I suggest looking at the work of Peter Lee, a former RAF chaplain, an academic at Portsmouth, who's written a book called Reaper Force, for more on that.
Thank you, James. Agnes, there's a question for you. I know you have to go desperately.
Okay, I'll take my last question, and then I will have to.
But there is one that's absolutely got your name on it. This is from Scott, and Scott throws a curved ball here. Says, are drones not a red herring? Is the problem not the fact that states are failing to comply with international humanitarian law and respect human rights, regardless of what weapons they use to do so? And for those who are not international lawyers, international human rights law is the law applicable during armed conflict. It's the law that concerns the protection of persons from the implications of warfare. And that's to be distinguished with the law regulating interstate use of force. That is the laws of war or use ad bedlam. So, Agnes, are we doing enough for international humanitarian law to be applicable?
No, I agree. I mean, we, you know, and in fact, I discussed that issue with my colleagues before writing the report, because for for the last decade, we are being bombarded, I'm sorry with the term, with evidence of states, military states and non-state actors completely ignoring and violating international humanitarian law, bombarding civilian objects, in particular hospitals and schools and markets, and not in an indiscriminate fashion. It appears that in many cases they are actually targeted for the sake of winning the war. So I absolutely agree that we are in a context where particularly the war in Syria has brought IHL to its knee, international humanitarian law, and the counterterrorism framework that has been building up since 9/11 has been part of the weakening of the international legal regime. In the name of security, in the name of counterterrorism, international human rights law and international humanitarian law have been heavily violated and weakened. So I don't have an objection to the point you're making. I think I'm just going to reiterate what I have said. The drones have specificities that make the need to regulate them and the need to keep emphasizing them important. They are the ancestor of the possibility of an autonomous weapon, or they are announcing far worse in terms of completely autonomous weapons. So we need to regulate the drones now that we have in our current armament system because of what they could announce, which will be far worse, and James has just described that. They are not expensive drones. They can be duplicated. They can take many shapes. They can be operated thousands of miles away. They can be used by non-state actors and by state alike. In the future, they could carry a nuclear load, possibly. For all those reasons, drones are, in my view, a weapon that we really need to get our head around, and we need to debunk all the myths that have been associated with them. We need to raise awareness about the implications of the use of drones and what they have meant for a central piece of international law, which is to distinguish between war and conflict. Drones have made the possibility of low intensity conflict everywhere. Drones carry war everywhere, including in peaceful places. I mean, drones have killed General Soleimani in a country that was not at war, neither with the United States nor with Iran, near a civilian airport. And that, of course, maybe could have been done by a normal plane, but I think it's more unlikely. So I agree with the point you're making regarding the destruction, the disintegration of international legal protection. But I do believe that we also need to keep focusing on that particular weapon because of everything that we've spoken about earlier. And on that, I will have to leave you because I'm already late for my next meeting, and I want to thank the organizers and thank you all for the questions, and James and David and Chiara and everyone else. Sorry, I'm missing the names for inviting me. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to you, Agnes. Thank you very much. You can leave. Thank you. We'll speak again. Ever so many thanks. And James will keep taking the last few questions. I see that some questions have gone unanswered, so but no hands raised. So I'm assuming you'd like us to read them.
I'm ever so sorry, but I also have to leave for another meeting.
Okay, who's this talking?
Pardon?
Oh, James. Okay, so James, you're wrapping up as well. Okay, fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you. So I think all the questions will have to be answered in writing, and hopefully, James and Agnes, we can send you a few more and you can help us answer them again. So James, thank you very much.
And I welcome anyone who would like to reach out or ask questions, and please do so on Twitter or via my email, and you're welcome to pass that out to people.
James, we will be in touch for sure. BCS is looking at a policy position on this matter, so we will be back. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay. Well, I have a couple more questions from the poll, so I think we could just, for the sake of completion, go and finish our poll here. So I don't know if you have strong views on this. Obviously, this is a legal question, but I'd be interested in knowing what the delegates think. So, do you believe that targeted killings can, at some point, ever be justified in international law? There's not a lot of delegates left. There's about a couple of dozens of us, so we can vote quickly. About half have voted. Anybody else who needs to vote, please make your mind now. I'm closing the poll in 3, 2, 1, and it's closed. Let's see the results. Okay, almost even here. So the majority is not sure. No, not sure and no, never justified in international law, and a few say yes. It is actually a very nuanced question, and the report do read the report. Is very detailed about the conditions for lawful killing. We have one last question. Let's see what we feel about that. And this is a contentious question, but let's see what the majority believes. And again, if you get to read the report, there's a very, very nuanced and brilliant analysis of that killing and the US justification for killing Soleimani in self-defense. The report obviously says no, it was unlawful, but you could, of course, disagree. So please vote now. I'm about to close the poll. The poll will close in 3, 2, 1, and go. Okay, let's have a look at the results. So 58% no, not at all. A few say yes, and a third are not sure. So wonderful. It is really a beautifully written report. I cannot emphasize enough. Normally, international law reports are pages and pages of hard to read, but this is a pleasure to read. My colleague Murtaza has produced a brilliant summary. And please stay with us. We will be, as BCS, writing more about this, but meantime, I can only invite you to attend our next and last event on cyber security and international law, 10th of September. And I'll pass over to Murtaza and then David, who will close the event for us. Thank you very much. Murtaza, what did you think? Okay, David, would you like to close the event?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chiara. Thank you to our guests, and thank you to Murtaza. It's great a great event, really interesting. It covers a lot of areas. Yeah, and we look forward to next week. And Chiara, how can people join the BCS? Have we got the link on the chat box?
The thing to do, I'll write it now. It's
great.
groups@bcs.uk. I repeat, groups@bcs.uk. This will firstly give you access to people who can put you on the list for BCS Law, and then you can ask them about membership. But the membership starts at about £60. It's not a lot for affiliate, and then you can increase your membership level as you progress, or if you like. But the website should allow to do this pretty easily with a credit card.
Sorry, I was muted earlier. It was a very enjoyable event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Murtaza. Fantastic. Yes, at the very least, please write to groups@bcs.uk and ask to join the law specialist group mailing list, so you'll never miss out on our events. Thank you very much, and good night, everybody. Goodbye.
Good night. Thank you so much.